After a societal collapse event, knowing where to stay away from can be just as critical as knowing where to go to be safe. When you and your family's life is on the line, staying away from trouble spots that expose you to unnecessary risk has to be a priority. Look, the world is a dangerous place, even at the best of times, and it is becoming more so every day. But when disaster strikes, when the social order collapses around you, it can become downright deadly. You need to know how to survive. And a big part of that is knowing where not to be. Today, we're going to cover 9 places you must avoid when the shit starts to hit the fan. Welcome to the wasteland, my friends. Hey everyone, my name is Chris, and you are watching Wasteland by Wednesday. And today we are going to be discussing some of the main places that you will want to avoid if you somehow get caught inside the city when the boom comes down for real. Now, the general idea, of course, is to try to be gone long before that happens, but that may not end up being an option. So, without further ado, let's get started, shall we? When it comes to the urban sprawl, almost nowhere will be safe after a collapse-worthy SHTF event. But in the immediate aftermath, some places will be much more dangerous than others and should be avoided at all costs. Bugging out of the danger zone has to be your first priority, so let's take a look at what places to stay away from on your way out of the danger zone. First things first, you got to get away from the epicenter of whatever calamity is struck, away from ground zero. This is where the danger will be most immediate, with buildings collapsing, fires raging, and who knows what else. Biological, radiological, or chemical contaminants could be spreading, gas, water, electrical breaks could become the source of new hazards, so you need to avoid those areas. Maybe the event was a natural disaster, earthquake, tsunami, whatever. Maybe it's man-made, a terrorist attack, a nuclear strike, you name it. Whatever the cause, the closer you are to the epicenter, the more danger you're in. I know it can be human nature to want to go see what happened, and many people will no doubt flock to the scene to gawk at the destruction, but trust me, this is one time that you don't want to be a spectator. You need to put as much distance between you and ground zero as possible, and you need to do it fast. In many collapse scenarios, the entire city may be something of a ground zero, such as a total grid down situation. So for those of you who think you can just tough it out at home, think again. If the disaster is bad enough, your home could be gone in an instant. And even if it's still standing, you don't want to be stuck there without power, water, or a way to get supplies. Trust me, in an urban environment, things will get ugly really fast. So when everyone else is running to look at the mess, you use that time to get the hell out of Dodge. When disaster strikes, crowds will also be your enemy. People tend to group together and follow the herd when they are scared. In a crisis, crowds can turn from calm gatherings of individuals into stampedes of panicked, desperate people. We've seen it before. They become unpredictable, dangerous. Even if there was some sort of government assistance or emergency services still functioning somewhere, these will only be temporary after a true collapse event. And you do not want to be there in the crowd when the supplies run out or the bad news gets handed down. You might get trampled. Oh, hello. Someone's joining us. You might get trampled. This is on the blooper reel for certain. This is Dabs, by the way, if I haven't mentioned it. Constant companion here. And always involved in everything. All right. I think that's about enough. Yeah? Maybe not? Okay. You might get trampled, caught in a riot, or worse. So if you find yourself in a crowd when the brown stuff hits the blades, your priority is to extricate yourself as quickly and safely as possible. Easier said than done, I know, but just try and stay calm. Take a deep breath, assess the situation, and formulate a plan B, which I should have done for this video. Begin moving to the edges of the crowd, and whatever you do, avoid bottlenecks. These are choke points where the crowd is forced to narrow, such as doorways, stairwells, and narrow alleys. Bottlenecks are incredibly dangerous places to be in a panic situation. Once you've safely reached the edges of a crowd, try to slip away at your first opportunity. You might think that a government-run emergency shelter is a safe haven in a disaster, with well-meaning volunteers and plenty of supplies. And you might be right for about 5 minutes. The truth is, emergency shelters can quickly turn into dangerous, chaotic places. In a major disaster, there simply aren't enough resources to go around. This can lead to fights over food, water, and other necessities. Such places can also attract the worst elements of society. When law and order break down, criminals and gangs see emergency shelters as easy targets. The criminal types that are already associated with chaotic environments in general will be some of the first to adapt to the new lawless reality of a post-collapse city. And even if you manage to avoid the violence and chaos, you're still stuck in a confined space with hundreds, maybe thousands of other people. And that's a recipe for disease outbreaks and sanitation issues. Consider whether you are safer there or on your own when considering a shelter. While it may seem attractive in those first panicky hours after a disaster, just be aware of the risks involved. You might think a hospital would be the place to be after a disaster. But unless you are seriously wounded, you want to avoid such a location after a collapse event. In an SHTF scenario, hospitals and pharmacies will be overwhelmed. People with injuries and illnesses will flock to those places hoping for treatment. But with limited supplies and staff, those places will become quickly overwhelmed. Long waits will turn into no waits as triage becomes impossible and the sick and injured are simply turned away. Pharmacies will be looted bare within hours as desperate people search for medication. If you're caught in the middle of that, you're in a world of hurt. At some point during the first days after a disaster, people will begin to realize they don't have enough of their prescription drugs to get them through. In the case of a collapse event, there will be a realization that resupply is never coming, and people will get the idea to go and get what they need by any means necessary. The inventory of critical life-saving drugs will rapidly decline in any urban area, and this will lead to desperation for many. Others who are less scrupulous may see this as an opportunity to acquire drugs to sell or trade to the desperate who are in need. Such predatory practices are going to become real common real fast. When the grid goes down, grocery stores and gas stations will be some of the first targets for looters. People panic. It's basic human nature. And when they panic, they do stupid things like storm the local supermarket and fight over the last can of beans. Before the event is really fully underway, there will be panic shoppers who are realizing the seriousness of the situation and looking to grab whatever they can get their hands on. Gas stations will be just as bad, if not worse. Everyone will be desperate to fill up their tanks so they can get the heck out of Dodge, but with no power, the pumps won't work. And even if they did, the lines would be miles long. Just look at the recent fuel shortages with Hurricane Milton in Florida. No powers means stores aren't processing transactions and they won't want to just give their goods away. So that panicking crowd goes home empty-handed or it turns into a mob. And that's when the reality sets in and the thin veneer of civilized behavior falls rapidly away. You don't want to be caught up in that. And if you prep correctly, you don't have to be. Gas stations and grocery stores will be flashpoints after SHTF, where peace becomes conflict real fast. It's best to avoid them if you can. Now, I know what you're thinking. Man, I got to get me a gun, right? And I agree. Having a firearm for self-defense can be crucial in a collapse scenario. But here's the thing. You don't want to wait until after the SHTF event to try and acquire one. Everyone else is going to have the same idea. Gun stores will be like ghost towns, picked clean within hours. Even if you do manage to find one that's still open and stocked, you're going to be facing long lines, inflated prices, and potentially dangerous crowds. The same thing goes for sporting goods, selling camping and other outdoor gear. If you need to buy supplies because your house is destroyed or inaccessible, you probably aren't going to get them ahead of the tens of thousands of other people looking for the same stuff. And you really don't want to be out there among the desperate masses trying. As a collapse prepper, you need to have already done a review of your anticipated survival needs. Think ahead and get your preps ready in multiple places around the city if you can, and even surrounding areas, before a catastrophe strikes. Having a storage unit on the other side of town, for example, can be a good idea. Keeping emergency kits and supplies in your vehicles, and even small survival caches buried out along your planned bug out route. All those things can help. So your plan doesn't necessarily have to include a gun, but acquiring one after a disaster will be difficult at best. Like the saying goes, better to have it and not need it than to need it and not have it. So if you're serious about having a firearm for self-defense, do it now while you still have time. Get proper training, practice regularly, and whatever you do, don't go rushing into a gun store after SHTF. In a collapse, people will be desperate. They'll be looking for food, water, anything they can get their hands on. And in most cases, they won't hesitate to take it by force if they have to. Out in rural areas where people are more spread out and there's less law enforcement, people will be more ready to defend against this. If you're bugging out to the countryside, you need to be aware that you're entering someone else's territory. They will have been preparing for this moment for years, stocking supplies and fortifying their property, and they won't hesitate to defend it from intruders. In a true SHTF scenario, people's anxiety and stress rise significantly, even those who are prepared for it. They will specifically be on guard against people coming onto their property. They won't want you anywhere near their land or homes. Often it seems those live in the city think they will flee to the countryside, and they expect to be welcomed with good old country hospitality. But anyone who has actually spent some time living in rural areas can tell you why that's a bad idea. Hospitality is for peacetime, and the post-collapse world will not be a peaceful one. Property owners are going to shoot first and then probably shoot again before asking any questions. So what's the solution? Avoid private land as much as possible. Stick to public lands, national forests, and other areas where you're less likely to run into trouble. And if you do have to cross private property, do it quickly, quietly, and without drawing attention to yourself. Part of collapse prepping is avoiding all that completely. You need to make plans and know your primary and alternate bug out routes and your bug out locations like the back of your hand. Do several practice runs with different routes and different destinations as well. Know where you are going at all times and steer clear of other people's land. In a collapse, the last place you want to be is stuck in traffic. I'm talking about gridlock, the kind where you're bumper to bumper for miles and there's no end in sight. Main roads can become death traps in a collapse. First off, everyone else will have the same idea. So you'll have tens of thousands of people all trying to cram onto the same roads at the same time. It'll be a clusterfuck. Second, main roads can be vulnerable choke points. Bridges, tunnels, overpasses, you name it. These are all potential bottlenecks that can bring traffic to a standstill. And third, main roads are easy targets for looters, gangs, and other unsavory characters. They know that's where the people are, and they'll be looking to take advantage of the chaos. There is also the possibility that in the early days, remnants of government or military services might try and shut down the roads as some sort of martial law type situation. No matter what it is, if traffic isn't flowing and you can't get out safely, you're going to have to find another way. You must escape the disaster zone. Staying within the confines of a ruined urban area is a non-starter for a prepper and a quick path to not surviving long. That's why it's so important to have a plan B, and by B I'm talking about bug out. Back roads, dirt roads, even old logging trails. The less traveled, the better. These routes may take longer, but they'll be much safer in the long run. In a disaster, industrial and commercial zones can be extremely dangerous places. These are often home to hazardous materials such as chemicals, fuels, and other toxic substances. And if there's a fire, explosion, or other disaster, these materials can be released into the local environment, posing a serious threat to your health. But it's not just the immediate danger you need to worry about. Many industrial and commercial zones are also located near waterways, which means that hazardous materials can easily contaminate the water supply. And in a collapse scenario, access to clean water will be essential for survival. So, when you're bugging out, it's best to avoid industrial and commercial zones altogether. Stick to residential areas, parks, other areas where you're less likely to encounter hazardous materials. Now, I know we said we were talking about 9 places to avoid, but really it all comes down to a single place, and that place is the city. Jungle rules are going to become the norm. Yes. Jungle rules are going to become the norm very quick after the collapse of civilization, but you really do not want to be in a concrete jungle when they do. Cities lack the ability to sustain even a fraction of their populations in a scenario where commerce, utilities, and government services have ceased to function. In a very short time, there will be very little left in the way of supplies of clean water, food, medicine, and so forth. And the lack of those necessities will turn otherwise normal people into animals in short order. Now, traditional preppers usually stick to the idea that bugging in is the best solution, and when we're talking about more temporary situations, that is often the correct approach. But collapse isn't temporary or localized. It's an entirely different animal from what most preppers are planning to deal with, a global and permanent one. All in all, the most important aspect of preparedness for the first few hours after a collapse event is going to be your plan for bug out and the means and routes you set to enable it. Staying in the city, even if your city wasn't particularly hard hit in the disaster, is still a grave mistake. Remember, the key to survival is to be prepared. Have a plan, have a kit, and know where you're going. And whatever you do, if you're stuck trying to bug out of the city, avoid these 9 places like the plague. This is the end of the world as you know it, and the birth of a new one. And like all birthing, it will be bloody, painful, and dangerous. Be ready for it. For more about societal collapse and what it will look like in major urban areas, I encourage you to check out some of the other videos on my channel which go into more detail on the subject. Thanks for watching, and as always, stay safe and stay ready, my friends. It's a wasteland out there.